Last writes, nothing makes us more vulnerable than loneliness, except greed. Thomas Harris I. A form stepped out from the fog. Its nature, being that of a seraphic domini, or collectively known under their ambiguous skies of Reaper, was unbound from negative existence into the reality-based sphere. Glitching, the presence manifested on the other side of the Agonagree's borders. No doubt, the interdimensional being had been dispatched by some dominating force on a journey that will most certainly end badly for the subject in question. Some human Sunatif, with their final sight upon them, would be subject to see such adjacent specters roaming about that their arrival would only serve to herald an awareness of another long step in Halation life's twisted fingers, that are rooted in all things. At night, in the dark, it whispers untold truths. As the chasm closes and is sealed, a more subjective threshold appears. The creature cracked its eye and beheld the spiral gate of the vortex. From this reference point, the wicked path of righteousness began unraveling before them. Gazing within the obsidian mirror, displayed upon the polished digital, was the entire rift, reminding the viewer of the land beyond the inside out, that we currently exist in. Though the course had been charted, it took the stride of a wanderer ready to leave it all behind to take the first step forward. All at once, they knew that if they were to hold their attention or to follow the light from the mirror and repeat the binary code in reverse, the result would be that the summoner would be reborn out, onto the other side, staring at the back of their own head in confusion. Notwithstanding the S-spools, if one can tap its energy, then many revelations could be revealed. Peering beyond their current abode, they quietly contemplated the landscape. It was like that of a painting or a manipulated photo, where the film was being fed through a filter, making the image gloomy. Denjisut left a trail in the sky. Clearly biological mechanics was at work, inhabiting the conscious with the creeping and crawling things that are all choked in endless ashes. There were many people roaming around. All of them were frightening to the wanderer. In the sky, strange creatures took flight amidst the foul and glided along with the clouds. They were swimming in the ether. The floaters, sporting bulbous heads, and under each crown there was a thick brain. The creatures excreted a yellowish-brown smudge that went up in the air towards the mill, under the clouds would pulse with an otherworldly glow. The cumuli were pregnant with shadows and the city smelled like exquisite decay. Hearing a shuffling behind themselves, they mirrored reality and watched as the scene unfolded before them. The picture was of a woman who had been limping along the sidewalk downtown. She was making little gasps with each step that she took. Her eye makeup ran from tears and dripped as she moved with the others at the crosswalk. When they did so, she lost her balance and tripped. Attempting to stop her fall, she put her arm out. The impact caused most of the meat on her bones to fall right off, splashing upon the pavement. The rest was still attached to the skeleton and began to violently writhe. The traveler cautiously stepped away as the meat began to hiss, cooking upon the smoldering blacktop's surface. Sizzling loudly, some juice from the corpse popped from the heat and spritzed them. Where the blood had touched their skin, it left a burning ache that promised a wet blister later. The skull and rest of the remains stopped moving. Presently, a curious circumstance occurred. The voyeur, not understanding what they were seeing, or weren't, were beyond wonder at the tragic death and then sudden fusion that independently occurred within the woman. The only way the watcher's mind could break down what was happening was natural transmutation. Their mind conjured the word, restart. When the heart had first come to a stop, it had at once been preternaturally replenished, becoming swollen in a deep shade of purple that quickly turned into an inky black. All along the bones, the connecting nerves and arteries looked to have a coat of black rust on each. She cackled repeatedly until the transformation was complete. The remade thing lifted itself up, as did the human avatar that was being stirred from unconsciousness. This other was about some not unlike business as death, the collecting of souls from the material world. This dreamer was themselves of flesh and bone and, in most cases, this is what prevented them from recalling the inside out as they awake, only sensing that they had a fitful sleep, soon to be forgotten among the illusions of the day. Squinting her eyes, she peered into reality. When the suspension wheels from the plane touched down onto the tarmac, there issued forth such a blood-curdling scream that it was like to have rivaled the songs of a slaughterhouse. The small plane jerked and rocked in violent resistance against the elements as time, like an hourglass, plucked at the strings of dominant release. Gaining her senses back, she looked around the cramped interior of the plane. There was the pilot, with his baseball cap on backwards, and next to herself was Dean, the only other occupant that she had so far met. Listening to the couple that sat opposite her talk back and forth, she had gathered enough information to conclude that the woman on the left was Kira and he was Lance. She yawned and tried to remember when she had dozed off. She had been resting her eyes once they had taken off from the big island, and to her surprise, she woke up when they were arriving on it. Tamar. The woman, Kira, who had natural red hair and hundreds of freckles, was to her very pretty. "You ever been to the big island?" asked the man who had blonde hair and a boyish face that she assumed was about 5 years her junior. "No, I have been to the Florida Keys though," she answered meekly. "Oh, cool. How about you?" "Yeah, when I was a kid, my pops took me and my sister there for a week. That must have been fun." "It wasn't bad, but now that I'm older, I realize the old man had probably only drug us along so he could look at the pretty girls." Kira giggled. "Oh, look who's awake," Dean addressed the dreamer, turned awakened. "Are we there yet?" she asked. "Actually, yes." "Good." There was a momentary silence as they all regarded her, which soon caused her to become self-conscious. The company all looked away at the same time. "I introduced myself earlier, but this is Kira and Lance." "It is Lance, isn't it?" Dean asked. "Yeah." "Okay, good." He paused, seeming to choose his words wisely. The plane suddenly jerked several times. "Get ready," called the pilot's booming voice. "We're here." Peering through the cockpit window, she saw they were approaching the building at the end of the tarmac. A few uncomfortable moments later, they were disembarking off the ramp. The vista before her was marvelous. In fact, the clear sky above was as blue as a tear fallen into the ocean of loss. The luscious greenery and the vast mountains in the distance complemented each other in the dance of millions of years. Heralded as one of the smaller islands in the Pacific, Itamar stands as a beacon to secrecy. Its sediments and vent tubes hold the secrets to creation. However, it seemed as if time had cast a shadow over the landmass and was just now being lifted, revealing this abundant garden. She very well may have been brought to tears had she not been called from her reverie. The moment glimpsed and then snatched away like the smoke of memories. "Mrs. Ramsey." The man who addressed her had also addressed her companion similarly. He was of a middle age with a shirt that sported pink flamingos on it, and his voice sounded British. His carefully cropped moustache lent him an uncle's quality. He continued, "And Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Mitchell. You are all to come with me." "Hey." "Yeah, you," the pilot asked him. "Yes?" "I need to see Liam. I'm quite afraid that's impossible." "Do you have anything for a guy named Rick?" "No." "Well, there's no way that I'm letting my passengers out of my sight without talking to Liam first." The guide took a breath and then thought better of whatever he had been going to say and pulled out his cell phone. After a second or two of attempting to reach Liam, the guide silently tapped his lips and then allowed him to join their party. "Follow me." The pilot switching his attention to the dreamer who was now awake. "Hey, I'm Rick." "Hello Rick," she said shyly. "Well, do you have a name?" Everyone's attention was stolen as they rounded the bend, the sounds of their feet echoing all about. If they kept following in this direction, they would be delivered to a house at the end of the path. "I'm Arlene." The guide looked back as if he was a teacher, and it was his duty to remind them of such. Raising an eyebrow, the pilot continued, "So, what is the show about?" "I mean, I know it's a reality show." The guide butted in, "A reality-based competition show. To win, one must rely on wit and stamina." "Last rites," he said as they traveled deeper into the forest. Many creeping things were discerned, and to Arlene's surprise, beasts as well. While she glimpsed the creatures, she realized the buzzing of locusts was dampening all other sounds. Gazing out to her left, she saw small monkeys chasing one another in the splashes of golden light that spilled through the canopy. She had the feeling as if there were many eyes upon her. As she surveyed her party, They all had the same mystified, yet weary expression painted across their faces. Are they the same rules as last year? When he didn't answer, Lance, shaking the hair out of his eyes, spoke up. Yeah, same rules, but now I know that it's fake. What? Asked the guide sharply, stopping the line. Arlene almost bumped into him. Last Rites is not fake, nor scripted. Whoa. Calm down there, chum. What I had meant was that my agent said instead of being cooped up on the same island with 6 occupants for a month and a half, it's only 2 weeks. Don't you vote each other off? The pilot, Rick, interrupted. My ticket says 14 days. Mine does too. Supposed to be a month and a half, but mine only says 14 days as well. So, that would be a person getting voted off like every other day, Kira reasoned. And a competition every even day. They all looked to the guide for answers. Yeah, give or take. The guide fumbled in his shirt pocket and pulled out a set of keys, just eyeing the man, clearly over-answering questions. After buzzing the company through a pleasant office and down a dark hall, he ushered them through an exceptionally clean kitchen into the backyard, which was massive. It surprised Arlene that she had not seen it from the sky when the plane had come in. There were several standing stones in the middle. That's where they would read the votes last season. From where she now stood, there was an immense opening of woods that surrounded the camp. Except for the few small houses that made up the circle. These other homes were for the crew and staff and of course, herself and the other occupants to dwell in. The guide's phone began ringing from his pocket. Once retrieved, he gave his apologies to the guests and said that he was to fetch the others and that he would return shortly. With a fierce look, he warned them they were to stay still and with a light-hearted smile, was off the way he had come. After he had gone, Rick went over to where there was a stack of lawn chairs and distributed them out. The locusts kept up their brooding chorus and the cacophony swelled as if building up to something sinister, like an impending doom of some sort, and since Arlene was out of her element, exciting. She smelled the pollen and recent rain. Lance sneezed and everyone looked at him. Then, realizing themselves, they glanced away. When Arlene looked back, there was a new face in the company. The woman had shown up out of nothingness. She was standing on the grass at the end of the steps, as if patiently waiting to be received. It was hard to distinguish her age. She looked to be around 20. She had paint on in geometric patterns all over her darkly tanned skin. In other spots, there were tattoos of intricate symbols that were strange. She did not appear hostile, and her lips looked to be whispering something. It was Arlene that tried to communicate first. Slowly approaching the woman, she noticed she had her hands behind her back, latched together. She approached. Lance, seeing her intent, grabbed her arm. No, don't. Don't what? I'm just going to see if she's okay. Just leave her alone. She might go away, said Lance. She might be lost or hurt, Kira put in. I don't think she's hurt, Rick said about her body. The loincloth she was wearing left little to the imagination. She whined a strange tune which issued at a rising in pitch with the locusts. She's a native of the island. That's why she has the white paint in these lines and rings, he said, pointing. They all heard car doors toward the other end of the house. The sounds echoing back and forth all about the camp. Looking back up, the woman's eyes were now open. She said something in a strange tongue, looking straight ahead, as if through the walls. Her eyes were milky white. Are you lost, sweetie? Where's your family? Arlene asked. Lance, looking around, yeah. To be a native, there must be others. Hey, how did you know she was a native? I mean, just look at her. Two separate circumstances then occurred. There were at first booming voices coming from within the house and she, the native girl, tossed whatever she had been hiding behind her back to Rick. He cried out and let his hand drop as it thumped onto the ground. Peering over the edge of the table to see what it was, the woman bent down like a feral animal, arms between her legs, rocking back and forth. Lily, Ginester, she hissed malevolently. Her dreadlocks and white irises were startling. Her face shook back and forth several times, causing her jewelry to click against each other. as if to steady her gaze, which her eyes would suggest was the case. All at once, from behind the woman many feet away, there appeared a man that was similarly adorned as she was, stepping down out of the greenery. A long string of slime dripped out of the woman's slack mouth. Boom. A gun fired. The bullet audibly shot through the brush. It was the man standing behind the guide. Then a few more unfamiliar faces appeared from the entryway. "Inna Allah," the shooter said in a worn voice with practiced efficiency of the native zone, but they had already disappeared as quietly as they had come. The shooter, after asking if everyone was all right, went and looked around the porch. Discovering whatever was lying under the table, Arlene advanced to get a glimpse. She stopped in her tracks as he met her gaze with irritation in his eyes, and then restraint which morphed into a smile. "Roger?" "Yes?" asked the guide. "See our occupants back into the dining room, please," he ordered. Inside the house? Appearing irritated, but then something snatched at his attention. "Yes," he said dozily. As she went in, looking behind herself, the man was staring down with a bemused grin on his face. 2 passions, while in the moment, can to one appeal like a game of chess, and to the other seem like Russian roulette. Just beyond the broken edge of reality, a vision forms. The lovers, having spent their minds and bodies to the excess of function, collapsed upon the bed amid a flurry of breath and sweat. A moment later, returning from the bathroom, he saw she was already up and had also gotten dressed. He sat on the bed next to her. She leaned over and kissed him. The sweat had dried upon his brow. In one motion, he rolled over on his side and getting up, he walked over to the door and cracked it. A gentle breeze edged its way in. He closed his eyes against the scent of cooking from out within the circle. He looked to be reminiscing over a former time when a vision of fire and crackling, burning. A shot in the dark and he braces himself. He jerked his head back and rubbed his eyes. He needed to get some rest, his body was telling him. Peering over at her, she was around his own age. Dark chocolate browns on her toasted skin with the tan lines from her bathing suit. To Liam, Susan was beautiful. Just before the first season, he had fallen in love with her pale blue eyes. Though there was something dark and hidden there. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. "Come over here and sit down, please." Once he had, "You've been straining yourself." I'll be fine. We have just begun." Which was true. He thought back to the many hundreds of hours he had put into it all. "I know," she gently slapped him on the leg. "Just another month to go." Month and a half. She lit 2 cigarettes and handed him one. All his senses leapt out at once and his stomach gurgled. Looking over at the clock, he grumbled. "Well, I don't know about you, but I have to get some sleep," she said as she leaned over and flicked the light off. She became terribly still. So much so that in the room's silence, plop. The woman slightly jerked at whatever she had seen in plop. Flicking the light on, and a second later, she jumped right out of bed. "What the fuck? What is it?" he asked, jumping up and going over to her side. She shook herself out of his grip and went into the restroom. Liam, going over to her side, saw the 2 drops of blood. "Huh, she must have had a nosebleed," he thought. "Susan?" "Yeah?" "There are fresh towels under the sink." "Thank you." He went over to the desk in the corner. Strangely enough, his right arm went out to where he used to keep his bottle. Damn. He cursed his own weakness. Here he was, musing. He looked over to the framed picture of his dead wife. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the forehead inflicted by a firearm. 5 years ago, now. His heart beat wildly when he pondered all the lives her decision had affected. The step-kids he had inherited out of their union. Her own ex before him was murdered shortly after the cold had snuffed out the inhabitants by the hundreds. Even that was 10 years or more ago now, though. Liam, the woman had returned from the bathroom and was addressing him. "Susan, I can hear you," he said. "You're feeling okay?" "Yeah, I'm good," she said as she sat down on his side of the bed. He went and stood in front of the still cracked door. Putting his arm on the sill of the threshold, he buried his face into the ditch of his arm. A moment later, he He just peered out into the humid night. "What are you looking at?" she asked from what seemed like a mile away. "I'm okay." "I didn't ask that. I asked what you were looking at." "I know." "Well, what is it?" Gazing down then back up, seemingly at the same patch of darkness. "It's just that a season has gone by now and a lot has changed, but everything, the last few years, goddamn my entire life, I had been searching for a reason, you know?" He squinted in to see her expression. Once he realized that she wasn't sleeping, he waved his arm around theatrically. "All this, and I thought I was going to find it." His eyes locked onto the photo of Alice and then back out into the vast circle of yard. "I thought I had found it back home. California, or St. Louis home?" "Both. I mean, either." "But you have finally found it?" "Yeah. Ever since I came here." "Oh. Landed the last Rites gig?" "I didn't land last Rites," he said dramatically. "I sacrificed for it. I thought you had to pitch the idea." "No. Ultimately, it was all money." "How did you know I was going to say that?" "I don't know, but what I do know is, there's another one of those boxes out there." "Boxes?" His breath caught in his throat at having spoken too much and he coughed. Suddenly, from around his back, Susan's arms enfolded him in her embrace. Turning around, he took her into his arms and kissed her. Their lips met fiercely, pushing his tongue into hers. She began the dance that they would do, the counterpoint working in concert with each other. He rolled over onto his side. "Thought you were going to get some sleep for the first day of voting?" "I am," she answered as she leaned over and flicked the light off. Getting back up to shut the door, he saw a fox or some other beast's nocturnal eyes watching him. Peering closer into the darkness, he turned his attention inside and shut and locked the door. After lying in the dark watching the lights bounce upon the ceiling, he mused, Roger must be at it again tonight. "Liam? Susan? Are you nervous about it all?" "Not really. I've been waiting since last season." "Right," she said as she flipped over and put her head on his chest. The lights that were bouncing back and forth on the ceiling magnified in a preternatural glow. Seeing the moon's radiant orb reflected in the window's glass, the clouds had parted, revealing her yellow luminescence. "Susan?" "Yes?" "How's Charles and the boys?" "Come on, Liam, I told you, when we're together, don't bring any of that up," she said bitterly. Flipping over onto her other side, it wasn't long before he could hear her soft breaths, slow and steady, as if purring. Like that of a strobe light, the sphere flashed over his closed lids. Liam was plunged into a register of memories, clicking slowly to its destination. All at once the ride was over, as if the roller coaster that he had been on was concluding for the season. He was sitting in a doctor's office. None that he knew of, but the room was lit by an open window. There's a Norman Rockwell painting of a doctor with a patient on the opposite wall. Knock knock. The door cracked from without. It was the lieutenant that he had spoken to the last several times they had come knocking. He nervously shuffled into the room. "Liam, hello. How have you been since we last spoke?" "Fine," he said, but it came out more of a croak. "Fine? Only fine?" "Well," the lieutenant's face melted how they did in his dreams. "With a check like the one that the old man wrote you, it would have been enough to pay for this damn island 4 times over." He was building up a sweat. "What did you do with it? What did you do with the other box?" His face was turning redder, and he was becoming very worked up, so he undid the top button on his shirt. "You ever find it? You ever find that other box we talked about? The one you promised Liam? How long have you been here?" The man started coughing badly. He kept speaking, but the room was falling away and there was what seemed like a loose net draped across the lights, so much so that the entire room became dimmed. As the lieutenant's voice faded, Liam's astral self sped away. Colliding into the ceiling, he was delivered topside, and he fell toward the sky. Though, after gaining several feet, he righted himself. What else could he do? He questioned. There was the briefest of flashpoints when he realized the shrouded landscape wasn't as it appeared. The sky was yellow ochre tinged with thick suspicious clouds that were blossoming. It was sucking in all the light, exuding a type of negativity. Soon there appeared a mighty school of floating creatures, resembling jellyfish, only on a grander scale. There were dull bruised spots on the mushroom caps of their domes, reminding him of dolphins. Just as the floater reacted as if it wanted him to stay. Yes, he knew it wanted to communicate something to him before he left. He was forcefully pulled. His arms were still reaching out. Everything was moving past so quickly that he scrambled for perches to gain a hold, but they just served to cut against his arms and further his unease. When he stopped moving, he found himself in a cul-de-sac. It had recently been raining and Liam was now soaked. He hunkered down as he heard voices approaching. There were 3 of them with a fence on both sides and another blocked them in. He got as far back as he could get. Here they came. 3 natives. They went to his right and then, as he walked through the trees, he saw that the 2 in the back were carrying some type of makeshift hammock. He couldn't quite see, so he crept a little higher up and his movement had cracked a weak branch, which had alerted a beast that was sleeping below. Waking it into a frenzy, the beast, to escape, had inadvertently rammed into the fence closest to it and then was off and away, squealing. The 3 warriors had since stopped. Not in the least bit shaken, but alert. After the brief pause, they picked up their burden and continued their way. When the man in the rear moved, Liam's blood ran cold. The lifeless eyes of Rick, the pilot, were barely recognizable through all the blood. 3. It has been dark for far too long. The barely perceptible light of phosphorescence is discerned. Reaching out, it caught the voyeur upon the current, going by the looming things that lurk in the dark. The glow pierced the void more fully, granting a peek. He swam up even further, his feet and arms gaining in momentum. Small eddies were spent upon the placid lake, causing the sleeping things to be stirred and caught up in its wake. Suddenly, the voyeur's crown broke water and there to greet them was a studio audience in the background clapping. The show, upon opening, the scene is a parting of the water along the Pacific, brushing the surface, causing minimal froth. Out of the silence comes the narrator's voice. It's Susan, Liam's host. On the other side of the ocean, there is an island that holds the grave of a seafaring captain from the 1800s. He traveled up and down the coast trying to support his family. One day, as he was searching for a big payoff, he found something fantastic. This something was so important that in 1842 he made a trip to Rome. For a lone fisherman, this was a very honorable invitation. This man, Eugene Crawford, returned and started the refectory mill for the people and had a church full of believers follow him right back into the ground. As she is telling the story, the scene changes, video and images complementing the unfolding of events. Upon his death, his wife sold off the property and remarried one local. Then she vanished. Though, after selling all his notes, an amateur archaeologist, one Professor Underwood, the scene shows a man with another following close behind. They are discovering a tomb, which was more like a desecration of a burial site or more appropriately, tomb robbing. Purchasing the notes at an auction, he had single-handedly deciphered some of the cryptic texts that were left behind. This led to a massive fortune. Upon the death of the archaeologist Dr. Underwood, his notes were published and 65 years later, another amateur archaeologist went on the hunt for the famous treasure. After 10 years of searching, he found it. One night, after being kidnapped by natives when he had first arrived, he had escaped and after he returned, he bought the island, and the natives keep their distance. Now, gaining a house full of what he calls occupants a chance to win $1 million but, like him, to come out as the Grand Overseer, one must escape the voting process each week in between competitions, all on the never-before-seen secluded island of Itamar. Named after that lone fisherman's boat. The image on the screen changes from Liam walking around on the island to that of Susan standing on a stage in front of a semicircle filled with the studio audience. Can they find a trail that leads to the treasure? Though, they must first survive the last rites. The crowd said this part together, and the camera panned out with a scene of the island. Presently, the show switches from the intro to the sound of birds and many angles of the various cameras around the house. The occupants were sitting and having small talk when they were all called into the living room. The camera's view from several angles switched to Susan coming through the front door. At first, no one notices her, and then she calls all the names that are to be competing. Dean, Kira, Lou, Arlene, Lance, and Ginger. When they had all made their way to the living room a few moments later, she looked at them all seriously and opened the envelope she had been holding. Occupants, you are each to make your way to the Blue Yard for a competition. They began to clap and hoot. This was their chance to become overseer of the house for a week. After meeting outside, the camera switched from the small security device to once again upon Susan, wearing sunglasses in mud. The host's blue bathing suit top perfectly complemented her skirt she wore loosely about her waist. She held the microphone in a tight grip. In television land, these competitions are pre-recorded while the voting is supposed to be recorded live. Sometimes, small deceits made the world go round. The show in real life just kept going as the cameras rolled. Lou, the construction worker from Maine, and Ginger teamed up while the acquisitions attorney, Arlene, was put alongside Lance and Kira, who was picked to join Dean. While for half of the 3 hours the game took a turn for the worse, Kira seemed like she was the most motivated this round, but was quickly taken at the end by Arlene, thus being excluded from this week's exile. On the show, after a break, the program returned and the mood was even darker than before, and the atmosphere was that of a monastery waiting on Judgment Day to arrive. Susan called all the occupants out one by one. Their faces appeared sullen and in expectation, with the highlights from the dozens of flickering tiki torches that were placed at geometric angles around the circle. Susan's cloak she was wearing made her appear like an agent of the goat himself. Her tanned skin somehow was giving off a soft radiance. Her red lipstick appeared black under the moonlight. Occupants, Liam Wilder, creator of Last Rites, she introduced the brainchild of the show dramatically. There was the beating of tribal drums in the background, like a heart racing toward a climax. Up the walkway comes Liam. With no cloak, because why? Well, this was his moment that primetime had promised him. He wore jeans and a t-shirt. His slightly disheveled hair swaying back and forth. His tattoos and lip piercing combined gave him an aura of someone who was over it all and didn't take any shit, but was humble about it, which made all his adornments pardonable. Occupants, he said, addressing them as they all stood in a row. Liam, with a malevolent light glowing from under him, caught a flickering aura. Susan watched from the shadows. You each have competed in this week's challenges, Arlene. The camera pans to her. You were this week's overseer, so you get a pass from this week's eliminations. She falls back into the shadows. Remaining occupants, you will now each vote, and as suddenly as he had appeared, he was retreating towards the house. Susan's silhouette appears and she steps into the light. Occupants? Yes? Have you each voted? Yes. I will now join Liam and we will read the results. The camera angle switched to her left. Right after a break with a word from our sponsors, she concluded. Smiling at the monitor, the camera veered out and forked. Time for a quick break. She walked over to the cabin. It was a small house, being thrown up for this express purpose, her and Liam's dressing room. Upon opening it and seeing him sitting on the ottoman with his head in his hands, she went to him. Liam, what's wrong? Is everything okay? He looked up and took a breath. Giving the wall a faraway look. Yeah, I'm fine, and then down at his worried hands. I saw it, again. What? Then recognition dawning upon her, a dweller, from the void? He gave her a nod and broodingly stared at a point on the wall. Boom. What is it? Liam yelled at the door. Only the soft pulse of the natives' drums could be heard. A second later, Susan yelled, What is it? Boom. In a heartbeat, Liam took the initiative and was up and at the door, opening it. It was Roger. Liam smiled awkwardly. Hey, you don't have to knock like that, he said. Oh. He looked around absent-mindedly. I hadn't knocked yet. I was on the phone talking to Renee. Liam said as he shared a furtive glance with Susan. Something I missed? Roger asked as he held the phone away from his face and gave the couple his full attention. When he didn't share their knowing, incredulous look, he just told whomever he had been talking to that he had to go and promptly hung up. Ray's looking for you guys. We'll be right over. With that, The sometimes guide, sometime messenger and unparalleled snake padded back toward Ray's booth. Shortly thereafter, the cameras were switching to Susan, addressing all the occupants. "Have you cast your votes for exile?" They all nodded their heads. The scene showed different days throughout the week and the other occupants in a confessional booth, talking about each other during the show. Each participant couldn't see any of the confessions that anyone gave, but versions are read so that the online watchers could take part in a poll for who they thought should be exiled. As each of the members looked around, Liam appeared. He was wearing the same attire as earlier, albeit now there was a dark shadow cast over his person. "Overseer, please name this week's chosen for sacrifice." Dramatically, with the drums beating in a panicked heartbeat, Arlene walked over to the area where the tiki torches were burning beneath the mighty standing stones of the island. "We have chosen Dean." His look of surprise was that of unexpected disbelief. As if his being picked was absurd. Liam came forward on his side. "Occupant, will you please gather your things and meet Roger at the front door, where you will board a plane to go back home?" Dean's surprise had, for a fraction of a second, turned to that of hatred as he gazed at Arlene. However, everyone in attendance had also noticed Dean's malicious expression. Especially the two bodyguards that were not wearing those sports jackets just for fashion. A smile replaced Dean's attitude just as quickly as it had appeared. That Takira was even more alarming. Arlene similarly felt the same as Dean was, only more resolute in her nefarious conquests. Dean smiled and shook each occupant's hand and quickly left. The cameras sent their security-like recordings to the stations. Finally, he gave Susan a hug as he walked out of the big double doors. Liam was nowhere to be seen. There were underlights placed in aesthetic niches along the property. Roger was there in a limo waiting as Dean got in and they left. At the end of the segment, on screen the producer read Sunset Hills. Shortly thereafter, Roger opened the door for him at the tarmac and shook his hand. "All right, Dean, I'll see you around," he said after helping him with his bags. "Wait. Where am I supposed to go now?" Dean asked as he looked around nervously. They were pulled up next to an empty-looking house that was next to the airport, which was beside a two-man tower with a small guest house that was attached to the tarmac whose small staff was apparently gone, because of the hour. "Rick will be here," he peered at his watch, 20 minutes. "Or so?" "Yeah." "Oh." Roger walked back and handed him an envelope. It had his name written on the front. He smiled and Roger turned and left. The only place to wait was in a smallish bus area that sat back from the landing strip. Dean lit a cigarette and the next thing he knew was he felt like someone was trying to cut his head off. The creeping woman had lurked behind the bench since before he was even there. "Yug, Dean blathered out. His face felt like it was being stung by hundreds of bees, and his eyes felt like they would pop right out of his skull. The beating in his chest had faded, as did the light from within his eyes as well. A few moments later, and thud, they severed his head right off, bumping along the grass. When it stopped rolling, Dean's eyes were looking at the stars, as if surprised at the cruelty of it all. The woman had halfway through Dean's decapitation, had her husband ride it back and forth until it detached itself from the weight of the skull. Using a mason's clay cutting cord had its benefits, the woman mused as his head toppled to the side and then, like tearing elastic, detached from his nape. In the silence, beneath the insects and distant drums, the severed head had plopped with a heavy thud. The woman, asking her husband if a head falls in the garden when no one else is present, "Does it make a sound?" He replied that no, for there would be no one to hear. Above, the lush canopy of greenery concealed the violent murder. The soil on this island, the natives would say, is from which all life had originally come and thus, would return. 4. Get up. Get up. They're coming for us. What's going on? You must get up, lady. They're coming for us. Arlene reached over, she turned the bedside lamp on. Billy, what are you doing in here? Can't this wait? Staff isn't supposed to come into our rooms. Bill, from the States, was here working with his older brother Mark for the summer. It's not a big deal, he said as he stood there, not exactly threatening to Arlene, but still dangerous. They both looked when they heard a disturbance in the house. Billy cowering down and Arlene, not wanting to upset the situation, asked him what exactly he was talking about and who. "Here, sit down," she said. She knew he had a crush on her, and he would obey. "Okay, so, you know Liam?" "Yeah? Well, I overheard one of those military guys talking about how he had something to do with it." "Who had to do with what?" "Liam, with the dead bodies." Leaning in he whispered, "Mark told me it's all going to happen the night of the meteor shower, on Uncle's anniversary." "What? What do you mean?" "Okay, so, Liam bought this island by finding the map." "What map? Don't you even know why you're here?" he screamed. "You're in on it, aren't you?" he asked with a disgusted look. Boom. The door was smashed open and here comes Geordie, the other bodyguard. Honestly, Arlene had only remembered seeing two of the angry-looking security guys, only remembering the ones worn army fatigues. Getting out of the room, it sounded as if Billy had challenged Geordie, but then Liam ran past, and they would no doubt overpower the youth. Soon, Roger appeared at the door and ushered her out into the front. After the military officers took Billy away, Arlene went into the small phone room to wait for Eric to call. It was smallish, with hidden cameras everywhere. At exactly 8 p.m., the phone rang. The following day, they were getting ready to vote for exile when Liam approached Arlene. It was dark out and he was coming out of his dressing room that was next to the occupants' own tents. The wind had curiously kicked up a small tempest. She had been staring at his door from her own tent since they were dismissed. "Hey. Liam. Are you doing okay? I heard what happened." "Yeah, I'm fine." "Did he hurt you?" "No, just freaked me out a little, is all." "Well then, what is it? Why do you look so upset?" "I'm not upset. Could have fooled me." "Well, it's just, okay, so, I didn't tell anyone because it sounded too weird, but Billy told me you were a part of some plot to bring dead bodies back or hide bodies." "What? That's ridiculous." "Really?" "Well, yeah, reanimates dead bodies." "Damn," he said as he looked away. "I wonder what he meant." "Well, his brother Mark said that he had been babbling about some such conspiracy or another and it had gotten worse the last couple of days." Liam, both conversationalists turned. Just out of frame, something darted past as Roger's eyes, resembling a deer caught in headlights, were frightened to Arlene. Whatever it had been, she had barely noticed, but both men had. "Roger, take her inside." "But Liam, it's time." "I'm right behind you guys." Returning just a moment later to the set, he got into character. He kept seeing the otherworldly dweller from beyond the void roaming about the landscape. He peered down at the cue card in his hand and suddenly became very warm. Roger gazed from his own dark shadows, calling Ginger up to the standing stones to read the verdict. "This week, we have chosen Lance as exile." He at first seemed upset. Standing up, he rushed over to the wall as if to punch it. However, thought better of it, considering that the set was made of actual stones. "Okay, now, remaining occupants, you have all been chosen for a bonus round to see who the last week's overseer will be." Liam's attention switched back to the exile. "Lance, please gather your belongings and meet Roger in front of the house." He nodded. The music cut to break and life in the yard carried on. Just a few short moments later, and Lance was getting into the back of Roger's limo. The air felt balmy and dank, but the ocean was pushing forth a cool wind. Though, when they had pulled up to the omnipresent airport with all its lights that were turned out, Lance felt as if there was something very wrong. A foggy mist had sprung in the 15 minutes it had taken to get there. Roger, assuring Lance that Rick would be along presently, had not heard as Lance yelled to the taillights that he had forgotten his phone. "Fuck," he said. Going into the first of two portable restrooms available, he was almost finished when he saw, while looking into the depths of the urinal, there was something down there. "Well, we will see shortly," his alcohol-fueled mind reasoned as he began urinating. Presently, his heart sank. It was the pilot. The realization and the stench hit him all at once. Oh God. He went to flee the receptacle when he slammed into the door. That's when someone pounded on the side wall. It went perfectly in time with the pounding of the natives' drums that had been going on night and day. Boom. 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 Lance stood back, incredulous. One of the military police would be suspicious if they continued to beat like that. Hadn't he seen one just a few properties back? He was relieved when, absent-mindedly fumbling in his pockets, he found the knife that he was supposed to have left in his bag. Being filled with a rush of adrenaline, he kicked the door, and to his surprise, it opened. All he could see was the safety lights going along the tarmac. He did a panicky circuit around the porta potty to see who had been messing with him. Rain gently spritzed his face. Ah! Approaching the back side of the receptacle, there was a native. The man from the other day. "Hello there, chum." He regarded him with something not unlike scorn. Lance, turning around, walked away to avoid any confrontation. "Ah," he said over again when he bumped into the native woman. She smiled at him with her razor-sharp teeth, her jewelry clicking, and when he turned back around, the man was bearing down on him. Lance quickly sidestepped the attack and the other had gone crashing into his mate. Lance, seeing that they were all tied up in each other's adornments, took off running toward the airport. When he got under the security lights, he chanced to look behind himself and no one was there. Taking a breath, he went up to the door. As he knocked, he could hear someone within. Quickly, looking back, he cursed his terrible luck and knocked again. No response. He tried the door handle, and it was unlocked. He tapped and said that he needed help and pushed as they suddenly shut the door back upon him. It happened so fast that he lost his balance and fell backwards over the door frame. Now, on the wet ground and being twice defeated, he got up in a storm of anger and banged on the door. "You're going to regret this. Not helping someone in need. You're a genuine piece of shit," he said as he looked up at the sky, who stuck out in the storm. Then, with recognition flooding over him, he walked over to the side of the house. "Holy shit," he said aloud. If he had started now, he could be back at Rogers in no time, and the camp was right there. He took off at a brisk run down the path and, whoop. Snap. A bug or something had stung him in the neck. He swatted at the spot and the insect must have gotten away or, no, he had caught it. It was in his hand. It surprised him when he held it between his fingers. It was a perfectly carved arrowhead. He heard thumping on the footpath as his vision blurred. "Oh shit," he said as he saw the native man stomping toward him. His white stripes and tattoos were very menacing to Lance. Something had gone around his neck. He got his middle finger beneath the clay cutter string, effectively trapping his hand to his jaw. As the man got up to him, he slowed, understanding that he couldn't focus on warding off her attack and his torments as well. His eyes bulged open, and the man stood back and grabbed the knife out of Lance's other hand. Standing back, he theatrically said something in that weird tongue. He arched his back like a fiend and bent down and howled at the moon. His hair was swaying in the wind. By the time that he had glanced back down, the man was aiming at Lance's gut with a small pocket knife. Malice was within each of his beady eyes. He plunged the knife in and gritting his teeth sequentialed so hard that the small knife had snapped right in his hand. When this registered, Lance was just now giving up. They had spent his strength. Zzz, she kept up the constant pulling. Now, she had her knee of his neck and was wrenching the mason's tool back and forth. Sweat was pouring down her forehead in beads mixed with the ever-slowing mist. Her dreadlocks blowing back from her forehead and the powder from the paint was all but off, revealing her true face beneath. Lance had meanwhile felt his belly with his free hand only to find a dull numbness there. He closed his eyes and all he felt was an unbearably sharp pain about his ears, and that drum was the last conscious thought to pass through Lance's oxygen-deprived brain. Click, click, went the cameras back and forth, perfectly in time with each other. A clandestine song was being sung, like one instrument leading the others who followed just a 16th behind. A ballet of observation was taking place. Click. The lens dilated to zoom in and listen to Kira and Ginger. They were trying to remain quiet. After the last few weeks of hot weather and with the sudden windstorm set to come in, both women were wearing hoods, adding to the drama. They were mostly whispering something about Arlene. The show expounded on this, making it appear as if they had been in league to rid her of the house all along. Click. The camera watches all, seeing each insanity grow from the seeds of corruption, invading everyday reality. Hopping and debbing its occulted blackness like tree roots that are sunk deep down within the earth. For the station, the director made the episode to appear as if the video feed would go from one room after another. Faster and faster, until it ended with a fading out of the house with an ominous-looking underglow, which gave the overall impression that it was being illuminated from beneath. The scene opens into the hallway and Ginger walking slowly, taking everything in from her perspective. There's a cello hitting anxious notes every so often, as if crawling along in anticipation. The scene changes and Ginger is in the confessional. Her short hair and pointy eyebrows gave her a slightly concerned appearance. I cannot stand Arlene or Kira. They're both whores, if you ask me. Arlene with all her random mood swings. I'm just thinking, you know what bitch, if you weren't so stuck up you probably wouldn't be so damn uptight, and Kira, don't even let me get started on her. Both worthless skanks had their meds thrown away, she said in an elongated voice. Because they are too stupid to get a new prescription before traveling across the world. Her voice returned to normal and conspiratorial. You know what? She asked the camera. They are a certain type. All the same, she said, laughing. And for another thing, all that sleepwalking business is fucking weird if you ask me. In yellow closed captions at the bottom of the frame it read, both. Yeah, both, she said, swinging her shoe back and forth. That girl Kira, she was just a whore for that guy Lance, but he wasn't shit. I could have fucked him the first night that we were here. There was a brief silence and Kira began laughing. Click. The camera feed switched to outside the house. The rain had stopped. Here was Roger, pulling up, and a static glow signaled a scene change to an unlikely room that was thought impenetrable so far this season. That was no problem. That's why Ray had been so adamant about logging into the hand-operated hard drives. So that when stuff like this happened, they were prepared. Click, the feed came to life. It was Liam, and he wasn't unaware of its presence. He kept pacing back and forth. The device on the door turned from red to green. After a beep, Susan appeared, and Liam's hopes were no more comforted than before she had arrived. Susan, seeing her co-producer's pallid complexion, went to him. Liam? Susan, he stopped mid-stride. Why didn't you tell me this was going on again? Come here and sit down, she said. Look, you have got to keep it together if we are to get this season finished. And in time. Guess what? No more deposits, and it's all a thrice-time return for us. It's not just a meteor shower or anniversary. It's so much more. Anniversary? Showers? What do you mean? Have you still been taking your meds? No. Oh, no, she said, contemplating the implications. His voice was rising with each word. Shower. As he finished, he threw the wine glass up against the far wall. Splash, went the fragments. Knock, knock. Who is it? Liam, it's Roger. Ray said that it's time. On our way. He says now. On my way. He screamed through the door. Listening close enough, you could hear Roger's ego leaving back the way it had come. Liam stormed over to the door and yanked it open. You don't understand. Neither of you do, but they all will. It's all happening for a reason, and I know that in the end, you're just as guilty as I am. He stalked out the door, slamming it and rocking the frame. Something had fallen and shattered. Susan, walking over to investigate what it had been, saw the photo of Alice, soaking up the remains of an abuse upon her spectre. Meanwhile, Susan came out of the dressing room, dark smoke following. The feed suddenly flashed, and the video was of Susan jumping and crying out from a thunderclap. Click. The 3 remaining occupants were congregating to the front door. Click, buzz. The feed was zapped, and all the lights went out and everyone held their breath. They could hear Ray yell at Geordie, and before he had time to respond, the auxiliary floodlights came on. Kira, coming out of the voting booth, smiled at the camera that was coming on. She couldn't tell if it was Arlene or Liam. The cameras weren't recording on the hard drives. In the communications room, Ray asked Geordie and Roger to go figure it all out. About 30 minutes later, the last Rites house came back online. Arlene was staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. The events from the last week had been so stressful, and now here she was, on her way to the end. She just couldn't understand where Eric got off trying to tell her how she felt. Lord, they hadn't even been together for that long. Though, he seemed to care for her, and it was cool how he had already known that they were back online. He must have been watching somehow. After she had related her end of the day's proceedings, Eric mentioned she should be on her medicine. There was the birth control, the anti-psych medication, anti-itch, her mood stabilizers. The list went on and on. I miss you. So, you'll be here soon enough. But I miss you now. Well, everything will work itself out. Time. That's what my mom used to say. Mine too. You're shitting me. Light-hearted illusions out of the way, and a few moments later was when the last of the great stalks were rent. It seemed harvest season was right with the moon. Arlene listened closely, as she could have sworn that she had heard one day that there was a world just beneath this one. And then another. Once she had related this curiosity to Eric, he told her she was being grandiose. Right before they had gotten off of the phone, he asked, "Did you and Ginger have it planned to kick Ira off?" "No, not exactly. We're not really supposed to talk about it." "Why?" Some rule." "It's because there are others listening." "Well, I think you're just being there." "What do you mean?" "Weird, paranoid, delusional. I've got to go. I can't do any of this right now." "Hey." "Yes, Eric. I love you, baby." "I love you too." Click. The camera spies Ira with her rollaway bag heading towards the door. After she got into the limo, she tried to call Roger through the intermediary window, but he was up there nodding his head along with the music. A few uneventful turns and sudden potholes later, and they were just now pulling up to the darkened airport. Once they had parked, Roger got out without turning the stereo off and hobbled his way over to her door and opened it. To Ira, Roger resembled nothing more or less than a bowling pin. She began giggling at the thought of him being bowled over by that wife of his. "Something funny, miss?" "No," she said. Getting her stuff, she just pulled the bags out of his hands. "Do you need anything else, ma'am?" "No." He walked away. "Yeah, hey. When's the plane or whatever going to be here?" Roger's expression of sadness turned to one of pure bliss. His smile was so artificial that Ira thought that this was his real one. "Oh," he said, looking down at his watch with a flourish. Smoke was all over since the rain had died down. "You remember Rick, right?" "Yeah, the pilot. He will be along shortly." "Talk to you later, baby," she said in an exaggerated voice. He got in and slammed the door. Ira checked the notifications on her phone when she realized Roger was peering at her with that same look. She liked it and waved at him with just her fingers. When he went around the corner, she felt alone for the first time since arriving on the island. Putting her earphones in, it wasn't long before she was lightly snoring. Ira, in her dream, was back home chatting with her best friend Becky. They were talking about Becky's boyfriend Curtis, who, in Ira's opinion, was worthless. She turned her head when she heard the whistle. It was coming from what seemed the other room. Then a feeling of wakefulness took her up and out of the ceiling to go right into the sky. Her astral cord guiding her right back into her body. "Fuck," she said as she saw it was now drizzling out. Sue, came another whistle. Ira thought she registered it, but knew she would have to step out of the enclosure that she was in. She realized she had halfway been dreaming. When the third whistle blew, she looked over as a light turned on at the house that was next to the tarmac. Fuck it. She stood up and pulled her hood up over her hair. She didn't want it messed up when she got off the plane. Yug, she fell hard onto her face and her phone went tumbling onto the wet grass. Setting up and looking down, she had been bound by her ankles with wire. Realizing the gravity of the situation, she looked around. That's when she saw him. It was the native man from when they had first arrived. He had been crouching down behind the seat she had been sleeping on. He had to have been within the enclosure the whole time. ear discerned shuffling feet behind her as something sharp was quickly wrapped about her throat. Someone forcefully yanked her back as the cord pulled beyond what she had thought possible. She felt something close to falling. Reaching down around her neck was wet and burned. Her face was itching terribly, and she knew that if she could swallow or just get one more breath, she would be okay. Again, she tried to get up, but in her haste had forgotten that she was bound. Black spots began to flutter and flash across her eyes, appearing as if they were spirits that were expanding upon with each winding spool of their touch. A dull thud was not so soon replaced by the dream of the people who lived on the island, and the rain was tapping on the roofs as if to rouse it from a long slumber. About 30 minutes later, Roger was retracing his steps. He had dropped his wallet somewhere. After searching for about 5 minutes at the airport, the fog was too thick to see through and he went back to the circle. Light penetrates the inky depths of blackness and rushes toward the placid surface. The intro of the show that related the fisherman's story and how it came to be, of Dr. Underwood's notes that led Liam to the island blade. The scene rushes through a network of cameras that blink one after another in rapid succession, going from faster to faster, blinking back and forth until Susan and the audience in unison say last rites together. The frame faded into the living room where Susan was informing us that because of the turn for the worse with the weather, they had brought everything in. She began over again. On tonight's season finale, we decided that the major overseer will do a road of symptoms, she said as she took a couple of breaths. The second camera angled in. The reception suddenly glitches twice, but it was no worry because soon the station went offline altogether. However, it wasn't a big deal because most of tonight's show had been pre-recorded a month before. As soon as Roger drove away for the last time, the rain began its insistent deluge and Liam was ready to check on his staff. Though, the staff didn't just include mercenaries. These were criminals from the neighboring isles who wanted a second chance. Some of their crimes being only walking on the wrong property or a frenzied bout of melancholy. They got a second chance here, for all its intents and purposes. The car picked him up later from the north side of what the natives call Winky Servo, which means roughly, site of landing. 25 minutes later, they were happy when they got to the shelter. Before getting out, he double-checked to make sure there were no malfunctions with his gun. "Everything okay, boss?" his companion asked, noticing the gun. "Yeah, I'm fine," Liam shouted over the rain as they approached the small house that was built last year for this express purpose. "Wazza, what kind of operation are you running here?" "A good one," he yelled back, his one good eye appearing surprised. "Goddamn, I can't see anything." "Right." They both trudged along. Where they were going, there were no roads, only footpaths. The rain, having picked up to a constant fixture, Liam was beyond soaked. Wazza, with his hand, felt closely at a rock's face. He began beating upon it with his meaty fist. The person on the other side must have known that it was him because the door had been unbound. When they walked in, it was silent. Liam had to cover his face from all the chemicals in the air. Gazing about, he was in a vast bunker that the non-allies had used during the last Great War. They were, according to Waz's father, where the officers had taken up residence, performing an advanced sort of alchemy or medical procedures. The line was often blurry on such matters. The survivors were locked up in here, and the rumor was that they had all committed mass suicide. Too proud to live after losing so much, and they did not contemplate the alternative. The people that survived until the last had gotten into a squabble and did each other in, most of them at least. The survivors, who developed a taste for their fellow man, ate the rest. Liam, being a devout atheist with his dog-eared copy of End of Faith along with Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion that was next to his bed, was completely at a loss on what to think about it all. Last year, after a long night of searching for a lead on box number 2, he had stumbled upon this bunker-turned-crypt. Wazza and his family said that Liam should have just asked, and they would have shown him the other door. The natives knew of the place but had at the time never ventured to open it. They knew better. He had been in one of the first chasms and had misjudged his footing when he plummeted 6 or 7 feet to the dirt. When he came to, he saw a rock that was at the base of the cave. Only after wiping away the decades of acclimated dirt and sediment did he see what was etched into the surface of the door. After wrangling up some local muscle, he cracked the bunker door. It resembled a submersible but was more like that of a tomb to Liam. There was something dragging at his fevered mind. A duo of stalactites was dripping into pools, reminding him of legends about Nosferatu. His flashlight having long since died, they could only see by a cleverly made torch that Wazir had constructed early on. That's when the first returned thing abandoned its hiding spot and attacked. Grabbing Wazir's brother Lyle by the shoulder, it took a bite out of his neck and spit the flesh onto the wall and violently went back in. This time it created a sufficiently big enough gash in his throat so that the company was treated to great arcs of red. When they had finally steadied their nervous flashlights upon the fiends, they all gasped, and a couple of the company took flight. It was horrible. There were several of them. They were the wasted remains of the people that the rot had consumed, turning them into these undead things. They were terrifying to Liam. Most looked about the same. Tall, white-haired, withered corpses that had escaped death somehow. Whatever turned them into such, had devastated them. The few remaining flashlights that didn't tuck tail flashed back and forth in a blurry collision scope of resurrection around the bunker. The feral abomination that had bitten the man's neck began ripping at its victims up until now, still throbbing jugular. For a moment, the rest of the company couldn't be forced into action, so terrible was their fright. Then, a dweller, a creep mass that lived, yet was not fully human, in the shadows crept upon the fears of man. It was then that Wazir's other brother Skillo attacked. The creeper was fast, and after a brief struggle, and with the aid of one of the other reanimates, they ripped the fellow's head off from his body in a shower of red rubies. After pulling apart the spine, they chewed on his guts, feasting upon his intestines. Though, nevertheless, the 25 survivors were their death. As Liam thought about it, fire flashed in his eyes. "Liam? Yes? Look." Wazir showed Liam his cell phone. It was an emergency alert. There was a big problem. The storm was upon them, and half of the island was destroyed. Sweat sprung upon his brow. Boom. The door had shot open, and Liam had to run to help close it again from the rain. One unfortunate member of the party, having been standing in front of the door when the gust came through, had been brained. He had in turn slammed into another man. From there, the first died but not in vain. The bunker door was now secured. The second man died in the night. Liam had nightmares that were from a memory from when he was a kid. His mind switched to the 25 soldiers that were also survivors. From these a story was gleaned. According to legend, if one was buried on Itamar, and their physical body was still somewhat operational, these circumstances became the perfect storm for resurrection de la mort. The natives say that the island grew, not just from a geological hotspot, but from what they claim was the first necropolis ever. The natives' explanation being that when the continent had split, the gods had come down from the landing place and made children with the daughters of man. After many generations, there was quite the graveyard. A meteor or flying dragon flew in and pocked the island with its fiery chemicals. If they were buried on Itamar, they would surely rise. Their hearts stopping short would wash themselves black and beat with the pulps of Venus and with the humidity turning itself inside out. The organs themselves beating not backwards, but black, with negative space. When the man awoke in the morning, he had infected one of his cousins, and the second man hit by the door awoke feral and in turn, ripped the throat out of another. He came back, and it went on and on and on, but with the lieutenant breathing down his neck and threatening that if he didn't produce another one of the boxes, then it was over. The best thing for Liam would have been for someone to level this operation. Alice had been right. We create our own heaven and hells. 7. After the monologue, they had shut the show down. So, Susan called her recent ally to take her to the drop-off point. Roger was not happy with having to go out into the storm, though was happy to oblige when she threatened to show his wife the photos of his BDSM weekend warrior romps that featured him with 2 natives. "I can't take you all the way to the airport." "It's impossible," Roger yelled over the drum that was echoing on the roof. Click, click, like the camera, that could either sharpen an instrument to a fine point or dull one's expectations down to nil. The 357 Magnum glowed under the vehicle's inner lights. "You will drive to the house," she ordered. 10 slow moments later, Roger's Crown Victoria inched along. It had bumped into the mailbox in front of their destination. "Now get out." "In this, really?" he asked. "Motherfucker, get the fuck out before I blow your goddamn brains all over the ceiling." And with that, Roger needed no further encouragement. He shut the door behind himself. Susan, seeing Roger disappear behind the wall of hammering wet, could finally take a breath. She checked her notifications on her phone. She had gotten a message 5 minutes ago. It had been from her contact. Suddenly, she heard a commotion come from beyond the vehicle. A heart-stopping moment later, and she had heard her name when the door opened. A man got into the front seat, struggling to close it against the torrent of wind. They both sat under the perpetual beat as he collected himself. "God, that was a nightmare," Ray said as he turned around, "but I got here." "Thanks," she said as he handed her the memory sticks. "You know what I always say?" She nodded her head. "Embrace it." Arlene, having opened the window, stepped out onto the ledge. It was just now morning, and the rain was still in full rapture status. Notwithstanding, the worst part had passed, the damage had decimated the island. She tried shutting it back again but couldn't. Peering down, she at once regretted coming out here onto the roof, but she had no other choice. Swoop, she caught herself. Like in a dream, within the bedroom from which she had just climbed out of, the door suddenly opened. If it went the way she had planned it, they would follow her out here, where she could push them off. It wasn't the best plan, but she had seen it in a movie once. She quickly hid on the side by the windowsill. The rain began hammering down worse than before, and she half expected massive hail to come down upon her at any moment. Fuck. She slipped. Whoa, she was going to be killed, with nowhere to run to. A fog seemed to be perpetually looming about the property. Great, she thought. As she inched along further, she heard them come through the room, on their way. Her mind panicked and seemed to rewind upon itself, skipping the scene that had defined not only the night, but the entire season of Last Rites. The scene repeats from just before they had all fled their own ways and to separate dramas. There was Susan now, about to reveal this year's winner. And the chosen sacrifice is Ginger. In person, the studio audience that had attended the show's finale began clapping. However, in Arlene's reality, Ginger had cried, so she tried to comfort her. Arlene couldn't help it as she reached over and gave Ginger a big hug. "Congratulations, Ginger. If anyone deserves it, it's you." Ginger, realizing Arlene's mistake, but not caring enough to correct her, gave in. "That means it's you," she said through gritted teeth. The rain steadily came down. "Congratulations, you are the winner of Last Rites, Arlene Ramsey," Susan said, more enthusiastically than she had shown so far during the entire season. Although, the second she finished the words, she simply made a beeline for her room. From there, it was all bad. After the host had fled, along with everyone else except for Roger, Liam stuck his head in the door and, seeing Arlene, smiled and went inside. The creator of Last Rites was soaked. Coming over, he congratulated her, but as Ginger was on her way out, Ray came in and told everyone they were going to have to sign a waiver, explaining that they would all be available next month for outtakes. 5 minutes later and everyone had gone. Roger promised to come back for her in 20 minutes after he decided which route was safest to take to the airport. Later, he stuck his head back in as Ginger was finishing packing. As the guide came in and shut the door, the kitchen window was shattered, which was followed by the loss of power to the island. Everything became fuzzy and a mass of confusion for Arlene. Roger was clutching his neck in the dark. He had been hurt. Whatever hit him was gone and away when the floodlights came back on. He was still moving. Blood was all over his mouth and in his moustache. He kept mouthing something. "What is it, Roger?" She put her ear up to his face. "Behind you," he breathed, and when she moved, a baseball bat came down and made a thick smack on his head. When it had hit, she looked into Ginger's face. At first, she was confused, but then she looked away, realizing the implications. "Ginger, what? Why?" Arlene, at the last possible moment, bounded out of the way. The baseball bat breaking on the statue of Venus. It toppled onto Roger. Arlene was out of the living room and into the kitchen in no time. There she could have stayed by the side of the door but had hurried up the stairs as an afterthought. She never saw Ginger come around the corner as she cut into her calf with the butcher's knife when she was on her tail. She made it to the steps. Gaining the first couple, she felt dizzy, and the blood had completely soaked her sock. However, so fast was her forward momentum that when she slipped, Ginger cut right into her thigh this time, but had inadvertently pulled away at an angle and in effect, bunted her in the nose. She cried out. Arlene tried to kick her again and missed. She quickly retreated, but the pain was too hot, too severe for her to keep this up for long. Just as Ginger was coming back up the steps, the sliding glass door was smashed. Glass and rain sprayed everything as Arlene limped up the last remaining few feet to the safety of the hall. The sound of the hurricane's fury was like that of a great thundering beast. Ginger ran up the steps. When she got up to the top, it was all at once quiet. There were 2 bedrooms, each with the door wide open. A bathroom directly ahead. Going up the incline and around the bend, there was another bedroom door, this one with blood leading a trail beyond. Ginger, with shaking fingers, pushed it open. Air immediately rushed at her, stealing her breath away. For a moment, she regarded her reflection in the burrow mirror. The paint had all but melted away, leaving only her pallid form. Going close, she didn't dare peek out. She just got the view of another wall of the house. Presumably, the opposite bedroom. Setting the butcher's knife down on the bed, she went and opened it. The sudden gust almost knocked her off her feet as she carefully climbed out. When she had caught her balance, she stood up and peered about. Something was moving along the roof on the other side of the house. It was the native man, creeping along the roof slats like a spider toward her. Thud, thud, a small brick hit her in her mouth, shocking. Effectively knocking all her front teeth out. From eye and wisdom alike, there was the sudden rush of white-hot pain. Miraculously still holding her balance, she heard a scream, and catching movement down below was who she had at first taken for the native woman, was something else. She glimpsed for just a fleeting moment as Arlene threw another one of the baseball-sized rocks. Thud. This one shot right past her head. Missing by a sliver. The next effort missed her as well, but the ricochet was not in vain. There having been sufficient malice behind it to throw her right off her feet, backwards onto the pavement of the driveway. Clump, went Ginger to the ground. A moment later when she had come back to consciousness. Groggily, she moaned at the pain as without warning something blasted the ground a few feet away. And then another down the path. Another came down with a squeal and hit the water with a splash. Their meteor shower, she thought. All at once, everything caught up to her with crystal clarity. She was almost killed but was alive. Attempting to swallow the blood and tears, she realized she couldn't move. She was paralyzed and to any onlookers, appeared to be dead. The last thing that she remembered was lying there in front of that house. She was the real winner. Is she the one that would survive? She just watched, as if frozen in frame, as Arlene danced with the dead. It wasn't long before Ginger fell into a cold slumber. One from which she didn't wake for many weeks to come. The end.